Okay, so my name is Joey Belans. Today's topic is going to be covering some trivial vulnerabilities that we're still seeing today in a lot of environments. I'll kind of be stepping back from your standard new tool, latest threat type of talk and kind of looking back at some old vulnerabilities as well as things that pretty much just go against your basic standard security 101 practices and still exist today. My name is Joe Belans. I'm with Efficient Security. I've been with consultant with them for about a year now. Prior to that, I was mostly on the corporate side. Kind of main reason I made the switch was to try to get more exposed to what's out there rather than just dealing with a single network and being limited in what I could do with that network. The other half of me has been a passion of mine for a while. If it wasn't in IT, it'd probably be hopefully or potentially have been a DJ somewhere. Still try to do as much today as I can. Hoping maybe be at DEF CON if you guys make it out there. Maybe have a chance to see me out in Vegas. So ultimately the problem that I'm trying to solve with this talk is kind of twofold. One, from if you're a security professional maintaining an environment, try to bring to light some common vulnerabilities that still exist today that really make my job very easy to do. The other side of it would be from a pen tester standpoint, making sure that things that look low or medium or not necessarily a risk in and of themselves, try to bring them to light to make sure they don't get overlooked when you're doing an assessment. So really the overall arching problem, I believe, is hackers have a lot of spare time. They've got an enormous amount of resources in front of them in the sense of the amount of data that's available out on the internet, things that they can get from services, what have you. Once they review that information, really all they need to do is find one weak link into an environment where the security guy pretty much has to maintain not only the technical side of the environment, but also dealing with your standard compliancy issues and your assessments and dealing with the developer who's telling you you're a roadblock for him getting his application done. Really, you're already overworked. You don't have time to really deal with all this. And at the end of the day, you're kind of fighting a losing battle. You just don't have the amount of time that an attacker's going to have. So what I'm hoping to at least help today is at least the basic stuff. Again, try to take what you already do on a day-to-day basis and kind of bring to light some things that we're still seeing as consultants that really just shouldn't be there anymore. And if anything else, you as a professional, make your site less of a target. At least if somebody like myself is assessing your network, or an attacker is going to make an attempt on your network, that you're going to at least make their job a little harder. And when all is said and done, you're going to be secure, right? Well, obviously not, but again, hopefully you'll be less of a target. So the vulnerabilities, I'll be introducing just some basic vulnerabilities that we're continue to see in environments. I'll describe the associated risks with them, some discovery examples, some real-world screenshots of things that we've seen in engagements that we've conducted. Time permitting, I will go through a case study that kind of pulls this all together, and then I'll open it up for some discussion. So Security 101, these are basic principles that every security practitioner obviously needs to follow. They are written in every standard, every best practice, every compliancy document. But yet, everything that I'm going to be mentioning today pretty much goes against these basic principles. I have to say, I was pretty naive when I took this job. I was expecting to find that my job was going to be a lot harder than it was, in the sense of it would be more complex, more that many of these basic principles wouldn't be as rampant as they are. So for myself, being new to the consulting side, it was actually very eye-opening for me. So we'll start with information disclosure. Obviously, in and of itself, may not necessarily lead to an immediate compromise, but enough if you divulge enough information to an attacker, give them enough vectors, they might be able to piece together a lot of that information together to perform future attacks. Some of the areas that I'm going to be talking about are application design flaws. These would be anywhere, your standard web application, if it's got a database backend. If you divulge the database that exists behind it, standard error message, you might reveal to an attacker if he's able to break that application, how he can go about, basically what techniques he can now use to attack that database. Clear text protocols, self-explanatory. They still exist today. People are still using telnet, still using FTP for various reasons. Obvious risk, anything that traverses those protocols is going to be potentially available to an attacker. Default configurations. Easy example is Tomcat. We still to this day find Tomcat all over the place with a default configuration, which typically can either be no password in place or in a situation where you can bypass the authentication. Null sessions, very apparent in misconfigured Active Directory environments. In cases where we find this, you will potentially be able to pull all the users within that Active Directory environment. And obviously, once you've got that listing, you can now, it's kind of more of a numbers game. Attempt to try to find any of the weak accounts that exist within that environment, which might now give you a foothold into the environment. And the internet. In some cases, you might be able to find enough information about an environment before you even send a single packet to that environment. There's enough between Google indexing, some of the tools that use the open source information that's available out there. You may in some ways be able to find pretty much a way to get into an environment before you ever send them a single packet. So some ways to identify some of this stuff. Your standard vulnerability scanners and mmap obviously will do a good job of finding a lot of these scenarios. Configuration management software will help with anomalies. If you've got your golden build in your environment and want to try to identify some of the places where you've taken the time to eliminate your default configurations, this can help identify anomalies in your environment. Manual testing, we find passwords in source code all the time, scripts that we might find that were used to tie things together, what have you, embedded passwords that might get us access into a database or other resources within the environment. Simple browsing, just kind of think outside the box. If you just go beyond the standard port 80, port 443, look at some of the other services you might have running in your environment, you may find that they're exposing services or other information that you just didn't know was there based on your standard port 80 and port 443 vulnerability scans. And again, Google, Pastebin, pick your poison. The information's out there. You may want to just take some time to, as a security professional, just see what has Google indexed, what's out there regarding my environment. So I tried to, the screenshots I'm going to be going through, I tried to arrange them in such a way that an attacker might think as they were to assess an environment. So just doing some simple Google scans. This first example is looking for some password files. I've come across scenarios myself where I was able to, either looking like on Pastebin, found somebody's Yahoo or LinkedIn, what have you, account had been, their password had been leaked online, just so happened that same password worked in the corporate environment. So you might be able to find some information there. Backup files. So this example shows some backup password files that existed out on the web. If I can gain those hashes, and it just so happens to be a client that I'm assessing, it might give me access to additional resources if I can crack those hashes. iOS backups. Again, if by downloading some of these images might give me enough information about an environment, or better yet, if I can get the hashes out of that backup file, might give me access to perimeter resources that exist in an environment. Who is information? Great for social awareness types of attacks. A lot of times you can find full contact information regarding an employee within the company, and that employee very well might have elevated resources within the company. Using your standard social engineering type techniques, might be able to convince a help desk person to change that password and now give me a foothold into the network. DNS zone transfers. Specifically, this particular one is a perimeter device. So not only now could I now have a mapping of the perimeter network, potentially of hosts that I didn't know exist based on other means, but even more so if it just so happened that this DNS device had internal information. I now might be able to map the internal network. Again, things that just should not be out there and we're still seeing today. Standard Apache messages. Pretty basic, give the version information, but now at least tells me what type of system I'm running. Probably low key, but again, just more information to attacker than we should be putting out there. ASP message, key piece here, the root path. Now that I know what the root path is of the web server, if I'm able to break this web server and ultimately upload some type of exploit, I now know where that exploit is. I don't have to brute force my way. You're basically minimizing the amount of time it's going to take for that user to go from the discovery of this vulnerability to the exploitation of it. Printers. Many cases, people look at vulnerability scans and they say it's just a printer. Well, not only could it potentially have a foothold into the network, but any data that's been printed, copied, faxed, whatever you, might be cached on that printer, and now you've potentially exposed it to an attacker. This one was a little, excuse me, null sessions. Again, I mentioned earlier, misconfigured Active Directory environment, showing the full information regarding a user that was pulled from the Active Directory environment without credentials. I'm guessing the assessor probably had a full listing of accounts that was in Active Directory, and again, at that point it's a numbers game. Just try to find the weak account. This one was a little unique. This was a Java application that just so happened when you access the site, it downloaded a configuration file down to the applet which told it where to connect. It was base64 encoded. Obviously, very easy to manipulate. You could pretty much tell the client to connect anywhere you wanted to, so if an attacker was able to somehow change that config file, they could ultimately perform a man-in-the-middle attack. Maybe if they learn the protocol of the environment or the application, they could ultimately hijack the browser, what have you. Insecure coding. So the three areas I'm going to talk about have, or at least two of the three, have been in the limelight for quite some time. Cross-site scripting, SQL injection, OWASP top 10 forever, but yet still exist in a lot of environments today. From a risk standpoint, obviously cross-site scripting, not necessarily a risk to the server itself, but more so to your employees, your customers, your clients, what have you. SQL injection can range anywhere from data leakage to full system compromise, depending on the nature of how deep the back-end database or how big the exploit really is. And user enumeration. At least personal experience, I don't know if this one's necessarily talked about much, but I found myself it seems to be quite evident in a lot of environments. A lot of companies are now moving towards account management or pushing account management out to the end user or their customers so they can maintain it themselves. As such, a lot of that functionality ends up giving attackers or somebody like myself the ability to identify accounts that exist within that environment. And again, it's now a numbers game. From a discovery standpoint, you've got your standard vuln scan. They're doing, I would say, a better job of finding some of this stuff. You've got your more in tune application vulnerability scanners that can help identify and are a little more in tune to these types of vulnerabilities. Your standard web analysis proxy, like for example, Burp has got a lot of the functionality built in to where it can do some automated testing for you. From a manual standpoint, obviously, Burp again, you can is a good tool to use if you want to just do some manual analysis of your applications. Source code review, probably the best way to find a lot of these flaws. And then there's numerous security numerous specialty and custom scripts that people have written that can help identify and or exploit a lot of these types of vulns. So a quick example, invalid redirect. This was an application that was identified that had a URL parameter that you could pretty much pass anything you wanted to, and when you made a request to the server, it would ultimately redirect you to that URL. So the example here showing that it was redirected to Google, great for a social engineering attack. If an attacker would potentially send an email to a bunch of employees using this vulnerability, and an end user might look at it and say this is a valid URL, therefore it's safe to click, and not realizing that the server itself is going to ultimately redirect them somewhere else. SQL injection, these 3 error messages were used to pretty much identify the back-end query that was being conducted by the application. By using the error messages that were provided, the assessor was able to identify the number of columns that were in the query, the type of each column within the query, and pretty much doing a simple union select and now have access to any of the data that existed in that database that was accessible by the user that the application was running as. User enumeration, it might be kind of hard to read, but ultimately what you see here is 2 error messages that were provided by a password, by a login screen. If you submitted a valid account, it would tell you invalid password. If you submitted an invalid account, it would tell you an invalid user account was provided. Again, you can now loop through just a list of potential accounts, find some valid accounts within the application, and ultimately now try to find any weak passwords associated. Outdated software. Most companies do a pretty good job of keeping up with the standard Microsoft patches. It's that ancillary stuff that commonly gets missed, or your environment has scenarios where that machine just can't be patched because we don't know if it's going to come back up, or it's running an old piece of software and we patch it, it may not work anymore. These are going to potentially provide assessors and or attackers a foothold in the network. Some standard ways to identify a lot of this stuff. Standard Nmap vulnerability scans, patch management software will definitely help you identify, or at least doing a better job of identifying some of the ancillary stuff that exists outside of Microsoft. Configuration management software can help you from a golden build standpoint, try to identify any anomalies that might exist in the environment. From a manual standpoint, Netcat, just connect directly to any service. Look at the versioning information that you might get back from it. And from there you can identify, is there any known vulnerabilities? Is it out of date? And then these remaining tools are pretty much going to identify any open source information that's available out there that that's been indexed or may provide you information about the services that are running in your environment. MS-08 067, it's been around forever. It's very easy to exploit, but yet it still seems to exist in environments today. Best part about it, you can exploit it any number of times you want. It really will have no effect on the system that's affected or system that's vulnerable, as well as it's going to give you system level access to the box. 5-year vuln that still exists today. This is an example of a TFTP application that had a directory traversal flaw. Ultimately was able to pull the system SAM and security files. At this point, you can grab the hashes associated with that box. More than likely, in many cases, the administrator password, will a lot of cases, the administrator password is reused across the environment, so therefore could potentially give access to other resources in the environment. Java, pretty much the standard banner when you access a Java applet is really the only thing keeping an end user from potentially causing or potentially keeping an attacker from exploiting something on the end user's workstation. I actually did a scenario where I sent out an email regarding a security awareness survey, and when you access the survey, it had a Java applet embedded, and half the recipients answered the survey and gave me access to the workstations of half the recipients that received the email. Excessive access. These would be areas that, if identified, can quickly and easily give an assessor or an attacker a lot of access to an environment with pretty much less or with pretty much minimal or no effort. Publicly exposed authentication interfaces, these would be consoles that would typically be held to, or typically should be limited to just local LAN traffic, like Telnet, SSH, any Tomcat consoles, things that just really don't need to be on the perimeter, but yet we're still finding them today. Very easy to exploit. Default configuration, so SNMP public, seems still to be rampant on the internet today. Local admin rights. Many organizations still give their end users local administrative rights. And just by all the vulns I've already shown, pretty much if somebody's able to get a hold of an end user, just click the wrong place, ultimately now you've given that attacker local admin rights on that box, and it's probably only a matter of time before those rights will get elevated. And weak credentials, anywhere from just a password one, company name one, to default account, to no password at all. Again, these are basic principles that still seem to not get fully enforced today. Ways of discovery, standard Mmap or vulnerability scans can do a decent job of finding this stuff. A lot of the vulnerability scanners have some minimal lists of default accounts that exist out there for various applications. Obviously, just use that. That should just be a starting point. Think about some of the applications that might be in your environment, and go do your own research. Make sure you're testing for those default accounts. Simple browsing. Again, looking past the 80 and 443, see if you can find JMX consoles somewhere or what have you. Simple Google search, looking for known web application consoles. If Google's indexed it, more than likely it means it's probably it's more than likely not even password protected and just sitting out there. And again, various specialty tools and scripts that are available that can identify or exploit some of these vulnerabilities. Simple web search, I was looking for a desktop web application. More than likely, any of these would be only protected by a password. If one of these happen to be in your environment, and somebody's able to compromise an account, ultimately you've now got access to whatever internal resource this is associated with. SNMP public, mentioned that earlier. Again, key aspect here, out on the perimeter. So now the attacker assessor would have access to information regarding that device. Now would potentially give them information regarding other means of attacks, or better yet, if the right community strings were also the default, now they might be able to potentially modify that device. RSH, old school shell, out on the perimeter network. By default, does not require a password. So I'm sure it did not take long before somebody owned this box. Tomcat, mentioned a number of times, very easy to exploit. If you can either A, find one that has a default password, no password, or a version that has the known authentication bypass flaw by default, very easily upload a WAR file, which would now give attacker assessor access to system access to that device. Depending on the rights of the depending on the account that Tomcat was running as, would ultimately give full access to this machine. Default Cisco account. This, I believe, was a VPN device, but kind of case in point here, Cisco device out on the perimeter network with a default account. If it happened to be a router or whatever, what have you, could potentially give not only potentially compromise the network, but ultimately might be able to give access to additional resources inside the network. LM authentication still exists today. For the most part, most environments, I can't imagine why LM authentication would still be required. Obviously 2003, 2008, now 2012, no longer need it, but yet it still exists in the environment, or environments that we've seen. So case study. So the next few slides was actually regarding an engagement I was working on while I was trying to pull this all together. And it just so happened that the vulnerabilities and or exploits that I used during this engagement kind of fell in line with what I was talking about today. Pretty much using most of the vulnerabilities I've already talked about, I was able to, from the perimeter, gain domain administrative rights within the environment. So it started with a user enumeration flaw. They had a password reset functionality, and ultimately using one of the web forms was able to identify a number of accounts that were valid within the application. From there, they had a password reset function, and I ultimately tried to find a weak password with one of the accounts that I had, and ultimately one had a password of company name 1. Just so happened they also had a Citrix environment that was only protected by a password. There was no second factor. Once I got in the application, there were 3 web apps available inside. They did their due diligence in the sense of when you clicked on any of those applications, it would open the browser in kiosk mode. But if you right-clicked on any of the links, it did open a new window, you ultimately got a web browser that had a full URL bar. Type in C:, I now had access to Windows Explorer, browsed over System32, and now had access, command line access to the box. So I figured, all right, it can't be this easy. But it was. I was able to now browse over to my lab machine, downloaded an interpreter shell, and was ultimately sitting on the box in an interpreter shell. And it just so happened that this user also had local admin rights on the Citrix server. Once I got that far, realized that there was a domain admin also available on this box. I ultimately assumed his token and now had domain administrative privileges in the environment. I was also able to access internal resources from this box. Obviously at this point I would probably have access to most all of the Windows environment. But to take it one step further, if you're not familiar with a tool called Mimikatz, Mimikatz exploits a flaw in the LSAS process, which will ultimately dump passwords of those that have been logged in plain text. So not only did I get the original password I had, but also the domain admin password, but there were about 19 other people that were logged in this server that now I had their passwords in plain text. So, obvious conclusion. Do some homework outside, look outside the box. Just because it says low or medium on a vulnerability scan doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to potentially lead to a compromise. Training. And this would go just outside of the standard security awareness training. I can't count how many times I've heard, I can't believe, or I never thought that an application could do that, or whatever have you. Basically, we need to get people in IT to start looking outside the box as to what can and can't be done with an application, and try to start hitting some of this, get rid of some of this crap. It shouldn't be here at this point. Questions, comments, concerns?
Who's Tom at Timo? I saw that in the screenshot.
You don't need to ask, do you?
There.
That would be himself. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.